It's the week ending Saturday the 3rd of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen lockdown restrictions eased in England, but cranked up in France, the Ever Given ship freed from the Suez Canal after a week in situ, and Sergio Aguero announcing he's leaving Manchester City after a decade. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Mr. Joe Evans, from the Week Junior, editor Felicity Capon, and the tallest man on our cover art, and in most rooms in fact, freelancer Arion McNicoll. Felicity, you are starting the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Don't adjust your set. This was the week another US election was contested.
Republicans say the recount is an effort to overturn the results. Democrats say it is their constitutional right. Yesterday, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell addressed the issue on the Senate floor. He said, quote, "Democrats are literally trying to overturn a state-certified election here in Congress," unquote. Republicans say it's clear. Republican Marionette Miller Meeks won. Her victory was certified by Iowa in November, and she was sworn in January. But Democrat Rita Hart is challenging the results, and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi defends the investigation.
An election of 6 votes out of 400,000 votes cast. This is not unique. This has happened maybe even when you were in the Capitol before, when races have been close, one side or the other saying, let's take it to the House.
Nancy Pelosi on KCCI News in March defending the investigation into election results from Iowa. So, Felicity, an underreported story about election results in America, you say?
Yeah, it was pretty underreported. It's quite complicated to explain. So I'm going to go back to November, and this was the race for Iowa's 2nd congressional district.
Yeah, I don't remember a Through the Night programme on the BBC about that one.
Republican Marionette Miller Meeks, get your tongue around that name, defeated the Democrat Rita Hart by 47 votes, and that was standard recount territory. So they redid the vote, and after a second recount, it was even a closer margin. So it was 6 votes at this point.
But she did win both times.
She won both times, fair and square. It was one of the narrowest results in American history, but Miller Meeks was ahead. And on November 30th, the Iowa Board of Canvass unanimously certified her election, and Miller Meeks was sworn in to Congress on January 30th by none other than Nancy Pelosi.
Okay, so why are we still talking about it in April?
Well, so far so good. However, the plot then thickened because Rita Hart, the Democrat, then asked the US House of Representatives to decide the outcome of the election. So she went straight to the House rather than the courts in Iowa. Which
the Democrats control, don't they?
Exactly. And she claimed that there were 22 valid ballots that were never counted. So it's caused a bit of a political storm, as you can imagine, because there are optics that don't look so good if you cast your attention back to the election last year and Trump and, the claims of hypocrisy on all sides and elections being contested and all of that. However, there has been an update in that the attempt now to reverse the outcome of the election has now been dropped. So Rita Hart has now dropped her challenge.
So it hasn't been dropped partly because people were pointing out that hypocrisy, do you think?
I think so. It looks as though there were actually quite a lot of Democrats who were very unhappy about the position that they were going to be forced into, and that there was so much I think there were so many people who said this just does not look good, that even if we do have the power technically to overturn the seat, and obviously it would be advantageous to the Democrats to overturn the seat, it would just look so bad. And I think that's the reason why they've now just dropped it and sort of backed away.
Yeah, I mean, it's not happening in a vacuum, is it, Arion? This is when internationally we think about political events in America recently, the Democrats have something of the upper hand. If you think about the storming of Congress, it just doesn't seem worth it to fight over one seat.
They do, and I'm sure that's the calculation that was in the end underpinning their decision to step down on this one. But it's such a complicated question, and I can understand why they went as far as they did with it, and I could even imagine why they might have wanted to go further and actually take the seat, because if it is true that there were these 22 uncounted votes that would have meant that the outcome of the election was the exact opposite of what it is with the Republican having won, then those votes should surely be counted. And I feel the sort of the frustration of the people who would have been advocating for the case to go ahead, even as remote as I am from the case, because unlike the whole business of what Donald Trump was trying to do, where he was trying to lead a campaign to overturn votes that anytime you counted them, still came out with the same result. If you counted all of the votes in this particular case, it would have resulted in a different winner. So it feels like one that possibly could have been pursued further.
Yeah, I mean, if there were only 6 votes in the recount, Joe, then obviously it was pretty close, and it is different in that sense to what Trump was trying to achieve. But at the same time, you think, well, if they've had the recount and the Republicans still won, I mean, what's the point of the recount if you're then going to take that to court? Surely at some point you have to accept the decision.
Well, possibly, but then if you think about the history of recounts in US elections and cast your mind back to George W. Bush's victory, that was a recount that only really worked because it went through the courts and there was the sort of dispute over hanging chads and all of these strange terms that became part of the normal political parlance for about 6 months while that was being fought out. I think the problem with this is that it's all the legal challenge was all being bankrolled by the Democratic national leadership. You had a lawyer, Mark Elias, who was the guy that fought off all of Trump's election lawsuits, now fighting a lawsuit on behalf of the Democrats to try and overturn what, as you say, seems to be a legitimate victory for a Republican candidate. And I think with the new administration in place, and especially an administration like the Biden administration that made such great political currency out of pointing out the hypocrisies of the Trump administration, it just wasn't a good look. And so you can completely understand from a sort of political expediency standpoint why they've decided to shelve this. And it's unfortunate for Rita Hart if there was a legitimate reason to do a recount, but I think that the greater party has won out here and that maybe one candidate isn't worth soiling the party's reputation over.
And when we get into these legalistic discussions, Felicity, and it is kind of about who's got the most money and who's got the best lawyer and who's got the biggest war chest, I wonder how the people of Iowa feel about that. You know, they're in America really brought up to believe in their democracy and one person, one vote. And it just feels like, yeah, it's about how you fight it.
Yeah, I thought that. I was really trying to think of if you were a Republican in Iowa and this was going on. I mean, you could argue this either side, I suppose, but I just felt like if you were a Republican in Iowa and you saw this and you saw that it was kind of being taken out of the courts of Iowa and immediately a challenge was going to Washington and to the House of Representatives, I think you'd feel really disenfranchised and really sort of justifiably angry about this. I think it's so easy to say that this feels really, really hypocritical from I mean, it's very, very complicated, but it doesn't look good. It looks like there's a lot of hypocrisy. And I think for me, it is that issue that Rita Hart, she could have and she should have initially raised her complaint in a special Iowa court, which was designed to resolve these kind of contested elections and that were bipartisan, you know, Democrats and Republicans who decide. And to sort of bypass that and to go straight to the House of Representatives, I think just seems unfair. And I also just think the fact that it was so tight, such a closely fought race within itself is also quite a big story. It shows how in this district, but I suppose you also saw it with the US election in general, that so many seats were on such a razor-thin majority. And what does that point to, if nothing else, but such a divisive, such a polarised country, I think.
And of course, Biden's campaign, Arion, was all about trying to heal those divisions and trying to make America less polarised. So this gives us an opportunity to look at that, doesn't it? 2/3 of the way into his first 100 days of the presidency. How do you think he's doing?
It's such a mixed bag, but on the domestic front, it looks pretty impressive. Like the stuff that Biden has done already is shaping up to be quite profound in terms of his impact on the country. Not only the $1.9 trillion COVID relief package that's sailed through and is going to, radically change the way that the country can fight COVID, and already he's doing a massively spectacular job on that front by delivering so many vaccines in such a short amount of time. But also the other things that are hidden in that relief package, it's estimated that at a stroke, some of the other provisions within that bill will cut child poverty in the US in half. So there's just this massive amount of positivity that's possibly going to come from that bill.
Yeah, and what I said to Arion, Joe, was about the polarisation of the country. And, we've heard from Arion basically how he thinks Joe Biden's doing. How do you think Republicans in America feel Joe Biden is doing? Because the goal was that he would start to win them over.
Yeah, and I think that when you talk about these razor-thin elections in places like Iowa, those huge financial packages then gets thrown into slightly different light, I think. If you think about how many of these races were very closely run and how many Republican voters there are that were very disappointed to have, not had their candidates elected, the idea of these huge $1.9 trillion bailout packages suddenly looks slightly different because the Republicans were not going to do that stuff. And I think it's fair to say that Biden has learnt the lesson of being Obama's VP when, after the financial crisis, Obama passed a huge bill that was meant to be a financial stimulus package that lots of people at the time said was inadequate and wouldn't meet the scale of the challenge, and is in many ways trying to avoid that same criticism again. If you were sat on the other side of the aisle in Congress, you may well look back at that package from 2008 and think that was too much money, and so scaling it up is going to only upset you more, and there will be lots of voters in a very polarised country who will feel similarly. They will feel the same as their representatives and think this is an extraordinary amount of money to be spending. And also often these people are quite opposed to the idea of lockdown regulations, the type of restrictions that are shutting down businesses that require this economic stimulus. And so you can see how this stuff could actually just serve to feed the political polarisation, whether or not you think that the actual package itself is actually completely necessary or not.
Yeah, I mean, here in the UK, Felicity, Jonathan Friedland in The Guardian described Biden as radical, that he kind of, campaigned as a centrist, but is actually quietly being a radical in the White House. Do you think that's right?
It's funny, isn't it? The New Statesman also are throwing up this word with him, and I suppose it's not entirely surprising that The Guardian and the New Statesman be quite praiseworthy of Biden. They obviously, it's the candidate they wanted, but I do find the word radical a really odd choice of word, because actually this 1.9 trillion COVID relief package, I mean, on whatever side of the debate you're on, it would have been mad not to do something like that, right? I mean, you have the same in this country with Rishi Sunak and the furlough scheme and all that sort of thing. You're seeing politicians of all different colours who are having to inject huge amounts of money to get us through these extraordinary circumstances of a pandemic. So I'm not actually sure that alone makes Biden a radical. I also think the jury is out. I think we have to wait and see what else Biden is going to get done and proposes to do. But I do think the choice of the word radical is odd. And I mean, also, Trump signed into law a stimulus package too. So it's not a revolutionary thing that Biden is doing. Trump also kind of did the same thing. I think one of the most interesting aspects of the Biden administration so far, I think the biggest crisis is the crisis on the southern border at Mexico. And I think that's another story that has been severely underreported, and I can't figure out why.
Well, on the matter of that being underreported, that's a strategy, isn't it, Arion? There's a blackout on it.
Yeah, and I think that the reason he doesn't want to talk about it and the Democrats don't want to talk about that business in general is because it's such a difficult problem to resolve. It's not the sort of thing... It's exactly what Barack Obama found when he got into office and wanted to close Guantanamo, but actually it was going to be an intensely long and difficult process. And I think that Biden's facing that same complexity in trying to...
Yeah, we know what we don't want to do with these people, but we don't know what we want to do with them.
You're right. Yeah, and even, the number of people who are, kids separated from parents and people who are stuck in sort of temporary, quite cell-like accommodation awaiting their fate in any case is huge. So they're just going to need time to resolve it before they can start to talk about it.
I think the challenge for Biden on the Mexican border is partly a political one, and it's partly an overhang of the Trump administration. The first problem is that it's a massively creaking system, and that it's currently housing, just to use unaccompanied migrant minors, 15,000 unaccompanied migrant minors, 5,000 teenagers and children stranded in Border Patrol facilities, and they need to clear this backlog of people basically before they can start trying to resolve the issue. One of the slight differences in terms of optics between these two things is that you don't have Biden advisors reveling in the fact that you have kids held in cages in quite the way that people like Stephen Miller, who was a national security advisor to President Trump, did. And obviously Biden has also got the difficult task of trying to balance the two wings of his party and also try to maintain support among floating voters ahead of congressional elections next year, that the Republicans would like him to enact the same kind of policies that Trump enacted, which he obviously can't do because he ran for president, partly on the position of a more humane approach to migrants. You then have sort of progressive sides of the Democratic Party arguing for completely impossible policies like reversing all deportations or banning deportations, which are totally out of step with the American public. Biden will need those progressive Democrats if he's to get the rest of his legislative agenda through Congress. And so he is sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place, really, having campaigned so prominently on humane migration policies. He's now having to deal with the fallout of partly the Trump administration's hardline policies, but also just an increase in migrants flooding the Rio Grande.
And I think so many calculations, like what to do at the Mexico border, are being underpinned by future electoral possibilities. And that's, coming back to where we started this whole conversation, I think the reason why the Democrats might have wanted to stand down now is sort of with one eye on the future. How will it look if we do this with this particular election at this particular moment? And how will it damage our chances in Iowa or with people who massively care about the Mexico border, to go back to the other example? And what does it mean for our future electoral prospects in general?
Well, and crucially, who they'll be going up against, Felicity, because finally on this, I feel like every calculation they're making, the Republican Party is also at the same time thinking, are we a Trump fan club or are we going to go back to something closer to Bushism? And that would make a dramatic difference, wouldn't it, to how the Democrats might be thinking about things?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think a lot of people will also be watching Trump to see what Trump does next. I mean, he's about to launch a social media platform, isn't he? And I'm sort of very interested to see the levels of support for it and whether he was kind of an anomaly and will sort of disappear, or whether Trumpism as a political ideology and a political force will remain, and how many Republicans will go along with it. I think certainly the crisis at the border, the Republicans are obviously very gleeful about and are trying to say that the media blackout is absolutely horrendous. So obviously there's a lot of political point scoring. But I agree with Joe that Biden has kind of got himself in a bind. This is the biggest crisis, but it's slightly also being caused by him because, it was his criticism of the Trump administration and his pledge to end the hardline policies of his predecessor, which created this perception that migrants would be given an easier route into the US. But I mean, above all, it is pretty shocking and untransparent to not have the media there to report on what's going on.
And when you say you agree with Joe, that's Evans, not Biden.
Yeah.
Our own quiet radical Joe. I'm coming to you next after this. Okay, Joe, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is Cuba on the verge of a medical coup?
Cuba has bet everything on making its own vaccines. There really is no plan B. But if the vaccine candidates live up to Cuban scientists' predictions, this small, poor island will be on the cutting edge of vaccine research.
Patrick Ottman reporting for CNN on the biotech industry in Cuba. Did he say Cuba?
He said Cuba.
Cuba, Joe?
Cuba is on the verge of potentially becoming the world's smallest country to develop multiple coronavirus vaccines. It has 2 vaccines that are currently in late-stage trials. It's developing 5 candidates in total. And the government in Havana has said that the vaccines will comply with all international standards, and they're planning to administer experimental COVID shots to the entire population of the capital, Havana, by May, if they hit their current deadline.
Now, Cuba is a poor country, so even in terms of the basics when it comes to COVID, social distancing can be difficult in the cities. You can't necessarily always buy soap there or rely on running water, so how come they have a thriving biotech industry with 2 vaccines on the go?
So actually, the sort of success of their biotechnology industry is sort of built on the same ground that the impoverished elements of their society are built on. And it's a lot to do with the fact that it's a communist island still. In the early 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to fragment and weaken, Fidel Castro basically decided that Cuba was going to have to be self-sufficient if it was going to survive and prosper. And so sort of emboldened by CIA-backed coups in South America and Washington's trade embargo, he decided to invest very heavily in education and healthcare, which sort of sowed the seeds for this strangely sophisticated biotechnology industry in what is, as you say, quite an impoverished country. So it's now home to 31 research companies. There's 62 factories across the country employing 20,000 workers. And they do have a strong track record in the vaccine area. Actually, they produce 8 of the 11 dengue fever vaccines used domestically and export them to 30 countries. And there's also kind of trials going on in New York for Cuba-developed immunotherapy treatments for lung cancer. So they do have this sort of proud history of vaccine development and medical development, which does date back to the embargo of the island, really, and the fact that it would have to become self-sufficient if it was to survive.
So, Arion, if the Cuban potential lung cancer vaccine is being tested in the USA, should we be thinking that these vaccines that they're developing for their own population might actually be an export success for Cuba in the future too.
Absolutely. And look, it's all going to depend on how the rollout goes and the results that they get from the two vaccines that they're trying. But they look really positive, and one of the really good things about one of the vaccines in particular is that it can be stored at particularly high temperatures, up to 46 degrees centigrade, which makes it a really viable option for low-income and tropical countries that currently are a bit sort of excluded from the vaccines that are rolling out across the West. So it could actually be useful not only in Cuba, but also around the world.
But then you have the question, Felicity, of what country would be prepared to give Cuba a load of money for their vaccine?
Yeah, well, I think Iran, isn't it, where Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei has banned the use of American and British vaccines, unsurprisingly. So I think Iran are pretty excited about what Cuba's doing. I think there'll be plenty of other countries. I think Jamaica was one that was mentioned in Central and Southern America who are in a really bad way right now, who will probably be looking to this. But I can't help but feeling a little bit more cynical about this story, actually. I think you have to remember that, ostensibly this looks like a good news story, and it could well be, but aside from the fact that this vaccine hasn't really been properly tested and is being sort of distributed, it's going to get the whole population kind of involved in trying it and testing it.
Yeah, we know it works, but we don't know what the efficacy is. That's right, isn't it?
That's what I mean. Sorry, the efficacy.
Yeah.
Exactly. But I think it's also really important to remember Cuba is an authoritarian, one-party state with extremely strict curbs on free speech, political activism and economic freedoms. And I think a cynic would have every right in saying that this looks like very nice propaganda and something that is intended to stir Cuban hearts and minds. I think the name of one of the vaccines is sovereignty. So there's obviously a big sort of national thing about it.
I'm so pleased AstraZeneca didn't go with that. Oxford just feels so much nicer, doesn't it?
But also, yes, the public health network in Cuba is very, very strong, but it comes at enormous cost to people's civil liberties there. And it's a very specific country. Not many other countries would accept the kind of close medical surveillance. Not many other people would accept having such tight control over their lives, and that Cuba does. So I just slightly wonder that this is a move to potentially bring prestige to a government that's under fire on all sorts of things. There's been free speech protests in recent months by artists and activists and all sorts. So I would hate for the headlines to be, how great is Cuba, basically.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it, in the context of COVID, Joe, how various different nations have attempted to patriotically jab their citizens, and I'm not excluding Britain from that list. Obviously, our government have a point to make about Brexit, and Russia and China have been doing similar things in their messaging.
Yeah, I think it is worth noting, just incidentally, and I always sort of feel the need to say this in relation to these stories, especially related to Latin America, that when talking about sort of PR coups for Latin American governments, particularly strong Latin American governments like one-party state governments, essentially like Cuba, it is worth noting that lots of Latin American people would probably say that the US's history of intervention in Latin America is not something that should be celebrated, and we shouldn't allow America to pull off a PR coup through the Moderna vaccine. 50,000 people were killed, 30,000 disappeared, 400,000 imprisoned under Operation Condor, when the US essentially backed death squads throughout Latin America. And so I think it is worth bearing in mind how this is perceived by people in the types of areas we're talking about. There is obviously this ethical consideration with Cuba, and they do have this history of medical internationalism, which they sent a team to Italy last year. They were dispatched to Lombardy when the virus was first sweeping across Europe. And there are these ethical considerations to take into account, just as there are ethical considerations to take into account with, say, Russia, for example, with France and Germany now lining up to buy or potentially produce the Sputnik vaccine in Europe due to vaccine shortages.
Okay, what you just said, the history of medical internationalism, I haven't quite heard that phrase before. What do you mean? I mean, all countries send emergency workers, don't they? So what do Cuba do differently? Yeah,
Cuba tend to sort of label it as part of a sort of international solidarity-based policy, the idea being that they sort of show solidarity with other countries that are struggling. So, for example, they sent a 53-strong team to Lombardy, as I said, at a similar time that Italy were trying to ring the alarm bell, essentially, in the European Union. Just before that, the Italian authorities had tried to set up a meeting of EU health ministers and had been told to wait 3 weeks. And so Cuba do tend to sort of leap on these opportunities to try and spread their, obviously, communist revolution by going and sort of winning the hearts and minds of people in various other parts of the world. And they label this policy medical internationalism.
Okay, but I mean, whatever their political goals and PR machine behind the scenes, Arion, wealthier nations are being accused of hoarding COVID vaccines. So it does make sense in developing countries for them to make their own. And this appears to be an exemplar of that.
For sure. And, you look at the Cuban model for even how they're planning to make money out of this. And their plan is to charge the nations that can afford it, but give it away to the nations who can't. And so, yes, of course, that's bound up with their own sort of propaganda effort to spread the good news about what Cuba is and what it can do. But at the same time, they're still going to potentially have this good thing that they've done. And at the same time, they'll have the opportunity to make a bit of money out of the countries that can afford it. And that will help to relieve the fact that there are people within Cuba who have to stand in line for bread and soap, as you mentioned at the top of this. So, I think that there are positives that come from this development, even if, there's an obvious propaganda effort that's going on alongside it.
I mean, I saw, Felicity, as well, that Cuba are thinking of offering a holiday vaccine program. So it's kind of come for the jab, stay for the beaches. Basically the mission. Do you think that could catch on? Redefine the Caribbean all-inclusive?
I mean, again, I can see why they're doing it. I mean, Cuba must rely heavily on its tourism industry. And I'm sure that, there's so many desperate people who are looking to locations around the world that they can go to. And if Cuba can kind of portray itself as one of the safe places to go to, I'm sure there are lots of Brits who will sign up and be ready to have a summer holiday in Cuba. So it's a clever strategy.
Could it help change the way they're perceived around the world, Joe?
I find that very unlikely. I don't think that the US is going to suddenly soften its approach to Cuba because they're exporting vaccines, especially not given that the countries that have lined up to accept the vaccine so far are Iran and Venezuela, which I don't think is going to endear them to the US at all. But it should be said that, this is one of various efforts by smaller countries to develop vaccines. There's efforts in Vietnam, there's companies there developing vaccines, and Taiwan is trying to develop its own vaccines. And as Arion said, what these countries often take into account that maybe Western developers don't take into account is environmental factors that make transporting vaccines very, very difficult. For example, keeping them very cold is something that's very difficult in large parts of the developing world. And so I think actually this is a sort of positive story, really. And even if it does take slightly longer and countries have to start their rollouts with the more difficult to transport, more expensive Western vaccines, if COVID vaccine jab appointments become a sort of regular fixture of the future, then having these smaller countries with smaller biotech industries that are able to produce affordable vaccines for countries and transport environments that are more akin to those countries that need them, I think that's a very positive development.
Okay, Arion, you're going to be finishing the show after this. Right, Arion, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, America was in the spotlight, losing its religion.
Am I reading the Bible every day? Am I going to church every day? No.
But you do consider yourself a religious person?
Yes. As long as you try to help people, as long as you try to make this world a better place, I believe you are Christian.
A clip from 12 News Arizona there, highlighting the decline in church-going by Americans. Arion, it's Good Friday. Couldn't you have sat on this story for another week?
I know, I'm sorry, not very religious of me, but yeah, a new poll came out this week that found that US membership of church, or actually any other house of worship, has fallen below 50% for the first time since this particular study began. And that's about like a 70 or 80 year period.
And so how high was it last time that they did this survey? I mean, has it been a dramatic fall?
In fact, in 2018, it was 50% bang on, and now just 2 or 3 years later, it's 47%. So it hasn't been a massive decline since then. But actually, since the turn of the millennium, there's been this enormously steep drop-off, because in 1999, 70% of people had declared a place of worship that they regularly attended. So we've seen this enormous 20% drop in that time. And prior to that, since records began, it was holding around, between 70 and 75%. So it was really very static. And then just at the turn of the millennium, you've seen this huge decline.
And I think I speak for us all in enjoying your reference to REM earlier. But this doesn't mean Americans are losing their religion, does it? It just means they're not necessarily necessarily going to a building to do it.
That's what this particular stat is about, but it also coincides with the fact that people in America are losing their religion. So you are seeing this huge and steady increase in non-believers. And that's kind of fascinating because America for a long time has bucked the trend where worldwide, the richer a country tends to become, the more it tends to lose its faith or belief in high powers. And America hasn't really done that. America has tended to be quite a religious country that is also immensely wealthy. And now we're seeing that really begin to crumble. And it does seem significant that this particular moment, we're now below 50% of people who are regular churchgoers.
It still seems high to me, though, Felicity. I mean, I appreciate where the trend is going, but if you're anywhere near 50% of people believing in God in a very developed and wealthy country, then that's still a very powerful force, isn't it? I don't mean God, I mean the church.
Yeah, 50% of Americans, it's a huge number, I suppose. So it's quite easy to flip it. And I also just wonder whether it is on a downward trend for much longer and whether it's going to start picking up in quite a big way, because I can't help but think that people will have really turned to religion and their faith as a result of lockdown. And just some of the articles that I was flicking through before this podcast on the situation in the UK seems to portray a picture of people turning to their faith. And one of the things, obviously, is you were alluding to actually going physically to a place of worship. And that's obviously been really hampered this year. And a lot of faith leaders are saying, well, that has really attracted people to finding out about, you know, what goes on in a church service without having to sort of commit physically. You know, they might not want to actually go to a church service, but can they sort of drop in on an online session and sort of dip their toe in and find out what it's all about? And the other thing, which is actually quite interesting, Holy Trinity Brompton, which is one of the UK's largest churches, they run an online alpha course, which is for non-believers to ask questions about faith and Christianity, and that's actually doubled. And Nicky Gumbel, who is Holy Trinity Brompton's vicar, he was sort of saying that, you know, he's never known a time when people are asking so many questions about God and God's worth and all that sort of thing. But he also alluded to the fact that there aren't any other distractions. There's no football, there's no sport, there's no entertainment. So people finally have the time to hear the gospel, which I thought was really interesting. And I'm sure he's not wrong.
I mean, from a Gen Z point of view, Joe, I wonder whether this change is happening as younger people are coming through the ranks who get more information from the internet, see more of the world and more diverse points of view. And also just maybe look at the scandals that the major religions have been involved with in the past few years. You know, sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church, gay conversion therapies, you know, supporting terrorist atrocities. I can imagine that generation is going to find it harder to buy the line from their parents that they just need to listen and obey.
Yeah, and to speak to your point about scandals in the church, it's notable actually in the Gallup poll that Arion spoke about earlier that membership among Catholics is down more than it is among Protestants. But I think you're right. I think especially if you think of the Catholic Church, there is a sort of war of identity going on in the Catholic Church at the moment about sort of what is authentic Roman Catholicism, you know, how strict do you have to adhere to the Church's teaching. And I think also a lot of sort of Catholic doctrine around marriage and sexual morals also doesn't square hugely well with Gen Z. There is actually quite a good book on this called Mass Exodus by a guy called Stephen Bullivant, and he also just mentions some quite sort of, you know, seemingly obvious but quite sort of personal reasons for not going to church anymore. For example, he spoke to people who just said they were bored of church services and they disliked the pastors that had arrived. They'd had bad experiences with specific pastors during confession, things like that. You know, it doesn't have to be sort of overarching trends all the time. It can at times just be sort of quite dull things about people's specific church experience that is driving them away from organised faith.
What do the figures look like for religion in the rest of the world at the moment then?
There was a really interesting bit of analysis that was done by Foreign Affairs magazine, which looked at the trend lines over the past about 4 decades, and they found that up until about 2007, they studied 49 countries and that represented about 60% of the world's population. And up until 2007, the great majority of those countries had religion that was increasing, you know, religious belief was increasing. And then from there until 2019, that has turned around and most countries have seen a steady decline. But it is the usual thing that the developing world has more faith and the developed world tends to have less faith. And so as countries get richer, this is the simple truth, and America is now aligning with this, they do see a drop-off in belief. And so that tends to be the trend. But of course, that doesn't mean that worldwide we're going to see the whole of humanity becoming less believing, because obviously the places that have the highest birth rates tend to be the poorer countries. And so that's where the majority of people are.
Do you think, Felicity, if this continues to decline in the States, that we would actually see a change in their policies that are linked to religious belief? I'm thinking about abortion, homosexuality, fidelity, the Middle East. There's a lot of issues that are the way they are in America because of the strength of the evangelical movement.
Yeah, I mean, it seems sort of completely intertwined and interlinked with so much of American political life, doesn't it? That I can't sort of even imagine that if faith is declining, that then these policies would also start to sort of drift away, and that, you know, things would change, and there'd be, I just can't sort of see it somehow. And I suppose also you have to remember that even if overall faith is in decline, there'll be some extremely political minorities and political people and political factions who will still fight every step of the way for their views on abortion. And I mean, I think abortion, it feels like that is in a really bad way, in that, you know, Roe v. Wade is really about to sort of almost be reversed, and the makeup of the Supreme Court in the US. So that it doesn't feel possible to me somehow. But maybe that's just a failure of imagination. I don't know. But I think what I find problematic with this story is that it's almost like making windows into men's souls, or whatever the phrase is. And we've just had the census in this country, haven't we? So when we see the results of that, it'll be very interesting to see what people are putting down. But I suppose, you know, what does it mean to have faith or to be religious? Is it going to church every Sunday? Is it praying privately on your own? Is it about ticking a box on a census where you sort of feel culturally Christian, but you might not be Christian in someone else's version of the word?
Yes, because the question is, what religion are you, isn't it?
Yeah.
It doesn't say, do you believe in God or
exactly.
not?
So it's quite complicated. And then I suppose you also have to think about the shifts that immigration bring. And I imagine that, you know, in certain pockets of this country, for example, that you will see church attendance massively going up with, you know, greater populations of Eastern European people, for example. So I imagine it's in flux, but I think overall I find it quite hard to know exactly what we're talking about when we talk about people having faith or not having faith.
There is one very prominent example, and that's India, which actually also kind of flies against the trend of countries becoming more economically secure and industrialising very rapidly and becoming less religious. And it should be noted actually that people identifying as devoutly Hindu in India has risen almost perfectly in parallel with the rise of Narendra Modi's BJP party, which is a Hindu nationalist party. So it does slightly raise the question of whether or not that is people that are becoming more religious, or whether it's people that are identifying more with their religion because it is so pivotal to sort of surviving in that society that discriminates against followers of other religions. But that is a notable example of a country that has gone the other way and is shifting the opposite way to America, in that it's rapidly industrialising. People's lives are becoming more secure, they're becoming wealthier relative to other countries in the region, and yet religion actually is on the increase due to sort of external circumstances, really, the politics of religion.
Well, happy Easter, everybody. With that, I will, on behalf of the congregation, be upstanding to sing the end credits. My thanks to Felicity, Arion, Joe, and God. Remember, you can subscribe to this show for free, the holy grail of prices. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, forever and ever, amen.